Bloodwoven, Book 1. Prologue. The instruction. Night had closed over the high road like a fist. The temple fortress rose from the black ridge in hard plains of stone. Each wall cut so cleanly it seemed less built than commanded into place. No torchlight burned along its upper galleries. None was needed. Pale blue lines lived within the masonry itself, thin as veins under skin, running through the blocks in exact repeating paths. They gathered at the gates, at the corners, above the blind windows shaped like niches, and in the carved circles set beneath the eaves, not like decoration but like tension drawn through a vast woven thing that had been hammered flat over stone. The light was not warm. It did not flicker. It held as if holding were labor. The fortress did not look inhabited so much as occupied by purpose. Every visible line suggested not welcome but correction. Even from the outer road a man might have thought the place less a house of worship than a blade-given walls. Nothing about it invited human scale. It seemed designed to make even the faithful feel temporary in its shadow. That disproportion was part of the lesson. A man arriving tired, devout, injured, or merely uncertain would feel his own dimensions corrected before any priest laid hand or doctrine on him. The fortress instructed by reducing the human first. A man standing before it might believe, not incorrectly, that the building had been made to outlast not only bodies but doubt. It announced, before any doctrine was spoken, that mercy would have no architecture here unless it could be turned into another instrument of control. Nothing in its design permitted accident. Angles met exactly. Distances repeated. Thresholds seemed measured not for feet but for judgment. A place like that taught obedience before a single doctrine was spoken. Below that cold illumination, the courtyard waited in ceremonial stillness. The horses had already been saddled. 12 of them stood in a straight black rank, huge-shouldered and motionless, their tack dark with oil, their nostrils giving off white breath that drifted and vanished in the mountain air. Iron plates guarded their brows and chests. Small runes had been cut into the metal and flooded with the same blue light that lived in the walls. When the animals shifted their weight, the marks gave a faint metallic hum, like struck glass heard from far away. The riders were waiting too. They stood beside the horses in full armor, silent as funerary figures. Their cloaks were black wool lined with something darker beneath, and their helms covered all but the mouth and the eyes. Each breastplate had been marked with the sigil of the order, a many-angled knot enclosed inside a perfect circle. The symbol had once been painted gold. Now, under the blue light, it looked almost white. Their swords hung at their sides, long and slightly curved, rune-cut along the fuller. The edges had been honed until they held no softness at all. One of those blades could cut a hanging strip of silk in air. One of those blades could bite into stone. None of the men spoke. They did not fidget in the cold or shift for comfort. They had the stillness of men who had already surrendered the ordinary habits by which bodies remind themselves they are alive. Only the horses breathed visibly. The riders might have been carved there and armed afterward. At the far end of the courtyard, the inner doors opened. Varn came out alone. He was taller than any of the waiting riders and broader through the chest, his presence made larger still by the black scale cloak falling from his shoulders. Beneath it, his armor was a darker iron than theirs, almost without shine, except where the runes had been hammered into the plates across his gauntlets, collar, and ribs. Those lines burned a deeper blue than the wall light, closer to lightning held under metal. The scars on the lower half of his face pulled white against his skin when he breathed. He wore no helm. He did not need one. His face did the work of a weapon by itself. He crossed the courtyard without hurry. The riders lowered their heads as he passed, not in the easy acknowledgement of soldiers to a commander, but in something more complete and less human. Varn did not look at them. His attention remained fixed on the chapel tower rising above the courtyard, where no lamp burned and no bell ever rang. He had been called there an hour earlier. No servant had come for him. No messenger had climbed the steps. The summons had moved through the grace in his blood like an iron hook, tightening once around his spine and then again behind his eyes. He had left his quarters immediately and gone up through the inner passages, past the locked archives, past the judgment hall, past the chamber where penitents were taught to name pain as blessing. At the top of the tower, beyond the last sealed door, the room had been waiting in darkness. Not empty, waiting. Even now, standing in the courtyard again, he could still feel the residue of that presence on the inside of his skin. It did not fade like memory. It lingered like command. Varn knew the difference. Memory belonged to men. Command belonged to what had the right to use them. He preferred command. Memory cluttered. Command refined. He had knelt on bare stone. The chamber had held no altar, no idol, no painted doctrine on its walls. It did not need them. The air itself had carried authority. The blue lines in the floor had awakened around him, first dim, then burning bright enough to throw shadows upward over the ceiling. The pattern they made was too complex to hold in the eye. If he looked directly at it, he lost the center. If he tried to follow one line, it divided into 5, then joined 9 others, then vanished under his knees and came back out somewhere impossible, like threads pulled too tight across a tear no hand had fully closed. It did not feel eternal, felt maintained. Then the voices had spoken. One had come like silk drawn over a blade. It was low, almost gentle, and so intimate that it seemed to lean close to his ear even though it had no direction in the room at all. The other had not sounded louder, but it had the weight of stone settling into place. It made language feel like architecture. Each word seemed to lock after itself. He had never named them. He had never been invited to. He knew better than to ask. A birth has occurred. The softer voice first, almost amused, almost pleased. A refusal, said the other. The word had struck through him with such force that for one instant his heartbeat had altered. Still kneeling, Varn had bowed his head lower. Where? He had asked. He had spoken into the stone. It was the only direction a man could speak in such a room. South of the river sanctuaries, said the silk-edged voice. In the hill country, in a place that does not know what it has done. The child would not take the thread, said the heavier voice. Varn had lifted his eyes then, only a little, enough to see the blue geometry spreading wider across the floor. That had never happened. Not in living memory. Not in any judged record. There were malformed births, empty births, births in which the gift came thin or crooked, births that ended in culling, silence, correction. But the thread was the first law written into flesh. It rooted. It found the channels prepared for it, took what it was owed and left shape behind. Or so the order taught. In practice, Varn had seen too many elders thinned to parchment devotion, too many old seers with eyes burned hollow by long service, not to suspect that the gift was never free. Even so, refusal was different from damage. Damage suggested weakness. Refusal suggested will, and will in the wrong place had a way of spreading once named. A child who would not take it was not merely defective. A child who refused the thread was an insult. Was it shielded? Varn had asked. For the first time, neither voice answered at once. The quiet had lengthened until it became its own instruction. Not uncertainty, calculation. The kind made when a hidden wall has been struck and those behind it are listening for cracks, deciding whether the damage can still be concealed. Even that pause carried authority. It reminded Varn that silence from such beings was not absence but selection, the weighing of how much truth a servant was permitted to survive. In younger men, such silence might have bred anxiety or the animal urge to fill it with speech. In Varn it produced the opposite. He had been trained too long by ordered fear. Silence from above did not unmake him. It narrowed him, stripping away all unnecessary motion until only obedience remained. He received it without resentment. Waiting under command was not delay to him but apprenticeship in scale. He did not resent the withholding. Withholding was part of rank. To be told everything would have implied equality, and equality with such powers was not a thought the structure of his mind permitted. He accepted the delay as lesser men accepted food or sleep, as something not his to govern, only receive. There are old stones in that region, said the softer voice at last. There are failures in the ground, said the other. There is something in him already. At that, Varn had felt, not fear, but a sharpening of purpose so pure it bordered on joy. The feeling was not pleasure in any common sense. It was relief. Confusion vanished around a command like that. Doubt, weariness, memory, all the lesser motions of a man's interior life fell away until only function remained. He had spent years refining himself toward that emptiness. Other men called such surrender devotion. Varn understood it more accurately as usefulness. Usefulness was cleaner than virtue. Virtue invited argument, self-examination, failure. Usefulness asked only whether one had struck where directed, cut what was named, endured what was required. It spared a man the rot of asking what kind of soul repeated such work might be building inside him. Usefulness absolved. A useful weapon did not need to know whether the hand that lifted it was just. That conviction had pared him down over years, stripping away every impulse that might have asked whether obedience and holiness were truly the same thing. He had been made for impurity like this, not for invention, not for judgment, for execution. There was peace in that reduction, and he had long ago learned to mistake that peace for righteousness. Not because he enjoyed disorder for its own sake, but because correction was the only form of meaning he fully trusted. Give most men a village and they would see people weather, harvest, excuses. Give Varn a breach and the world became simple again. Where others experienced ambiguity as burden, Varn experienced it as appetite waiting for authorization. Once command named a target, every complication around it turned to waste material. That was the private relief he would never have admitted in doctrine. Not love of slaughter, but gratitude for clarity purchased by permission. Command removed the burden of deciding how much of himself remained human. Do you want the child brought living? The question had mattered. There were things that could be examined only while they still breathed. Even asking it had clarified him further. A living subject meant patience before ruin, precision before ash. The answer came from both voices together. No, a single word, perfectly joined. Then the heavier voice had added, "You will erase the breach," and the softer voice with terrible calm, "You will leave no hand that sheltered him." Varn had bowed until his forehead touched the floor. The stone had been cold enough to hurt. He welcomed that too. Pain made vows feel entered in the body rather than merely spoken near it. The order understood that principle everywhere. In kneeling stones, fasting cells, training yards, confession chambers. A truth that hurt lasted longer in men raised to mistake endurance for sanctity. "By the order," he had said. "No," said the voice of stone. The correction had landed like a mailed hand closing on the back of his neck. It was not merely rebuke. It was clarification. The order was structure, emblem, doctrine, and rank. But structure existed to sheath the deeper claim, not replace it. Varn felt the distinction enter him with the force of a vow renewed in bone. He did not experience humiliation exactly. Humiliation required a self large enough to be wounded by comparison. What he felt instead was gratitude for being reminded what layer of power he truly served. By us. The blue light had flared white. When he opened his eyes again, the chamber was dark. The lines in the floor were dead. He was alone, with his pulse hammering under his skin and the taste of metal in the back of his mouth. Now, in the courtyard, Varn reached his horse. The animal was the largest of the line. A black brute with a scar down one flank and one blue-lit rune plate over the brow. It turned its head toward him but made no sound. He laid one gauntlet hand against its neck. The grace moved through iron, hide, and blood. The horse went stiller than before. One of the riders stepped forward and offered him his sword. Varn took it. The scabbard was black leather over wood. The guard and pommel were iron. Runes had been cut into the blade all the way down to the base of the fuller, each groove packed with silver metal and sealed under oil. When he drew it an inch, red light licked once along the edge and was gone. The rider who had offered it kept his eyes lowered. "Lord," he said. That was all. Varn slid the sword home and mounted in one movement. Around him, the other riders did the same. Leather creaked. Stirrups rang softly. Cloaks shifted. The horses stamped once and settled. High above, the blue lines in the fortress walls seemed to intensify, throwing the whole courtyard into sharp relief. Black horseflesh, black armor, white breath, pale stone, and Varn at the center like a blade held ready between two fingers. No man asked the destination. No man needed to. Purge rode with its own unmistakable silence. Among soldiers there were many kinds of departure, and each made a different shape in the body. This one stripped the human from the riders before they had even cleared the gate. That was why the order prized such companies. Men who marched to war might still imagine resistance, valor, the possibility that those ahead would strike back and therefore count as opponents. Men sent to purge were trained out of those reciprocal fantasies. They rode not toward contest but toward correction. In another life, on another road, men might have ridden with banter or prayer or the rough comfort of shared dread. Here there was only alignment. The company had already begun to become the order it carried. Even the horses seemed to understand that nothing living waited at the end of this road except those about to stop being counted among the living. What rode out from the fortress was not a company marching toward battle, but a sentence already decided and only now being carried to its destination. That was the purity Varn prized most. The moment when judgment shed all debate and became movement. Even the horses seemed to know the difference. Their stillness was not calm but containment, as if the same command that had passed through Varn in the tower now waited in their muscles for release. He looked toward the gates. There was no need for a shouted order. The men under him had been chosen for obedience so complete that speech was often only decoration. Still, tonight words mattered. The command had already been given in the tower. This one existed for the men, for the horses, for the stone, for the night itself, so that everything present would hear the purpose plainly before it began. "Purge," he said. The gate mechanisms answered from within the walls. Locks withdrew one by one, each with a sound like bones snapping deep underground. The two leaves of the gate opened inward. Beyond them, the mountain road descended in a long switchback of frost-silver stone before vanishing into the forests below. Cold wind entered the courtyard carrying